When do you actually start seeing TWI after the war in US? When is the first time you read about TWI? Can you remember what kind of books or material you read in?
Yeah.
At TWI?
Yeah, actually in 1997, Miyazaki Imai's book Gemba Kaizen was published, and right at the same time, Jeff Liker's book Becoming Lean was published. So I got both those books and read them, and in Jeff Liker's book, actually it's John Shook's chapter who wrote it, in just a sentence or two he briefly mentions TWI, Training Within Industries. And when I read that I thought, well, what does some World War II program have to do with the Toyota production system? Well, that's interesting, and moved on. Well, the very next book I read was Gemba Kaizen, and in that, in one chapter in particular, he talks fairly extensively about TWI, and when I read that, I went, I've got to find out what the heck some World War II program has to do with the Toyota production system. So that actually started me digging into it, researching it. Actually, I called the Kaizen Institute, tried to get a hold of Mr. Imai, actually got a hold of Brian Hammonds, who was the president of the Kaizen Institute of America at that time, and he referenced me to Dean Schroeder and Alan Robinson's articles that they had written in late 80s, early 90s, that they had referenced in the book. And called Alan Robinson, and in talking with him, you know, he kind of told me a little bit about the program. And one thing he did tell me that in depository libraries around the United States, the TWI information should be in there. So I went to the Milwaukee Public Library and started digging through their archives, trying to find stuff. And it, wasn't categorized or anything, so I went there multiple times and didn't have much luck. I found a few brochures, but they didn't really tell me not much. But eventually on one trip, I uncovered the 1945 report. So I took that to Kinko's, made copies, and when I sat down reading it, I was shocked. Actually, I'm going to back up on that. I went to Kinko's and made a copy of it, and actually went home and looked at it and went, a 300-page government report? I'm not real sure how interesting that's going to be. Actually, I stuck it on a shelf for several months, but I kept looking up at it going, I actually did about a year process on and off. I spent a year digging for that thing. I had called departments in the government in Washington, D.C., because I was under the War Manpower Commission. I knew that didn't exist, but I was wondering who absorbed it, but I didn't have much luck. Called the archives. But after probably 6, 7, 8 months, I finally said, I went to all that effort to look that up. I might as well read that thing. So I pulled it down and started reading it, and said I was shell-shocked by what I was reading. Because earlier in my career, I had actually worked for Ison Seiki, which was a Toyota Group company. So I'd gone through some Toyota production system training there. I'd gone to some of the original Kaizen workshops back when productivity was Productivity Press and Productivity Inc. was a single company called Productivity, and they put on these workshops called 5 Days and 1 Night. So I went through those. So I'm reading this the report, and it's the same thing that was in this training I went through with the Shinji Jitsu group at this at the Danaher Corporation for the 5 Days and 1 Night workshop. But the other thing it disclosed to me, it gave me the actual names of the manuals, the original manuals. So I went to the library and through interlibrary loan started ordering these original manuals. And actually when the first one came in, which actually happened to be Job Methods, plopped down right there in the library where I got it, started looking through it. And I was so stunned by what I was reading, I was literally looking over my shoulder thinking, well, somebody's gonna be spying on me. I can't believe what I'm reading. All this stuff that we thought came from Japan, came from Toyota, it actually had a different source, original source. And actually through that, when talking with Alan Robinson, he mentioned to me about this. There's this fellow that works for Sanyo Corporation that you should talk to. There's this guy out in New York State that had been calling me. Of course, the fellow at Sanyo, I did get a hold of him, was Patrick Grau. And the guy in New York State that was interested in it also was Bob Rona. So that's how I made the connection with them. Yeah, so in the course of speaking with Alan Robinson, he'd introduced me to Patrick Graup, and we'd talked on the phone a few times. And once I got the original manuals, I'd actually talked to Patrick again, and he'd mentioned to me, oh, I'd love to see the original manual. He was working on writing it in, translating it from Japanese into English, and he was wanting to do a comparison to try to make sure they're keeping true to what the original manual, original training was. So I made a copy and mailed it out to him, and talked to him a while later, and he said, "Wow, it's amazing how these things haven't changed at that time in 60 years."
So actually the reflection is that the basics still work.
Yeah, the basics still work.
Yeah.
And even for that matter, and I'll talk about this tomorrow, is I'm going to take a step back 200 years and walk forward, and essentially the essence of it hasn't changed.
So the companies you see, Jim, because you see a lot of companies with all the conferences and you have a lot of contacts all over, the companies that actually succeed with sustaining TWI and also with the lean progress, are there any like key things you can see that they do to succeed? What are like the trigger points in them succeeding?
Probably several of them. Try to think them through here.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say one of the keys for them to succeed is understanding the concept of in a way learn by doing. To translate that a little bit more, or explain that a little bit more, is a lot of people come to these conferences anywhere, and they really kind of want, hey, we want to do this lean thing or TWI or whatever it might be. Can you tell me steps 1, 2, and 3 so I can go do it, and life will be wonderful? Well, it doesn't work that way. The companies that are really successful with it really learn is, I certainly need to learn the tools, the principles, TWI, but I need to learn how to do it in the context of their own organization. Because there's a saying, I guess a Toyota saying is, it depends. People say, well, how do we do this? Lean, Kanban, TWI, and the answer is, well, it depends. So the thing they really need to do, the one thing that makes a company successful, where they understand that and they're willing to figure out what does that it depends mean. So what are their needs? What are their burning platforms? What is their existing culture? What's their existing processes? So you get into, that's the observation. We talk about good observation. So good observation is going to the Gemba, going to see, going to talk with people, questioning. The whole questioning attitude is building up your current story or your current state, we use a lot of times, and figuring out where you're at. And then, okay, where do we want to get to? What are objectives we're trying to achieve with this? And then putting together your own picture on what's this mean in our own environment. So the companies that are most successful get that. It's still a struggle. I mean, there's still bumps and bruises along the way, but the ones that get that and really are persistent in figuring that out, those are the ones that are more successful in the long term, and also more successful at even a higher level.
When we talk about the Toyota temple, right, the house of Toyota, there's the bottom, the foundation. Mm-hmm. In many places it says basic stability. This basic stability, when you read the article from Art Smalley about basic stability, he mentions the 4M. Can you tell a little about the 4M and how that supports the Toyota house?
The 4Ms, man, machine, materials, and methods. And it's really about understanding your current state, your current condition. Those are all elements in a business. It doesn't necessarily have to even be manufacturing. There's aspects of that, even if you're in healthcare, if you're in banking or finance, there's all those types of elements play a role in it. So it's really understanding, again, what do those mean in our current situation? What do we use? How do we utilize them? How do we want to utilize them? Or what are our problems and how do we address each one of those in order to resolve our issues, to meet our objectives? That's something else that plays a role in this, even with TWI, is how does this play a role in our strategic objectives? So that's where you get into understanding that and then deploying it. So if you look at things like policy deployment, deploying objectives to meet our strategic objectives, how do these things all play a role and how do they interact? So that's when you get into the 4Ms. You're doing the same thing with those. How do those interact and how do you modify those, change those, adjust those, learn about those in order to achieve your objectives? So I'd say really about the 4Ms, it's really about really becoming very intimate with those, understanding that. Again, back to the saying, go to Gemba. What are you going to Gemba for? To understand each one of those elements in significant detail so you can start making decisions on it. So you can look at your objectives, you can look at your current state, you can look at your objectives, or sometimes we'll call that target condition, and start figuring out what's the path, what are the changes, what are the things we need to learn in order to make each one of those steps along the way.
Yeah. So this basic stability we're talking about right now, the foundation of the house, right? With the 4Ms in it. How do you see that lean companies jump to continuous improvement instead of focusing on the basic stability? What are your reflections on that? Is it okay to jump over this basic stability, or should you really focus on basic stability first?
Yeah, you really should. You must focus on the basic stability first for a couple reasons. One is if you're not stable, then you're going to perpetually stay in that firefighting mode, and that's something you're trying to get out of by creating stability so you can build from that. The other part of that foundation is, and this is one of the main reasons why TWI is so important, is to have a stable foundation of skills. If you have that stable foundation of skills, that'll help you achieve the foundation of stability, particularly again back to the 4 M's. Stability in those, again, understanding those, having the skill to make those stable so you can build from it. It's kind of like that old saying, you want to build your house on sand or you want to build your house on a rock. Obviously the answer is you want to build on a rock. You need something stable there because you don't want it to shift, you don't want it to change. Otherwise, again, you'll fall back into the firefighting mode. And even from companies being successful, again, that's probably another one of the points on for companies to be successful, to understand that and to build that foundation, that stable foundation in place. Doesn't mean you won't have mishaps here and there, but overall you have a pretty stable environment you can continually build from.
We're looking at the foundation, and we talked about how to create the foundation with the 4M. So what are your reflections on or thoughts on, once we've created a solid foundation, how to maintain that? Is there some kind of trick or some kind of angle for management to be motivated on maintaining the maintenance?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it'd be a trick for management to maintain that. It's certainly something that's very deliberate. I mean, you've got to be very deliberate about maintaining it. So that's, several things. One is, obviously when you're bringing in new people into the organization, that they're trained on these same basic fundamental skills that your people that are more experienced already have. And then also some level of mentoring through that process. You want to maintain that. So you always got to maintain that. And also too, and there's a huge variety of ways to do this. Companies kind of audit to a variety of degrees on, are we maintaining these basic skill sets? Because again, if you don't maintain those basic skill sets, you may start off on a rock building and making improvements and all that from, but eventually that rock's gonna become limestone, eventually become sand, and then you'll become unstable again. So it's very critical that you maintain that skill set. And that's one thing, probably one way to do that as you develop people and they move up through the organization. That's why, again, another reason why it's so important to get that foundational skill set, especially like TWI in there. As these people move up through the organization, they bring that understanding and experience with that understanding with them, which helps mentor or coach and understand back down through the organization that they maintain that skill base in place, meaning that same skill set, because those things are so foundational. In a way, even though TWI, you're targeting the frontline supervisors, and as you said, like General Eisenhower, the sergeant, what was that?
Is the Army.
Yeah, the sergeant is the Army. The same type of thing. If they have that understanding, not just down here, but as they get up in the higher levels of the organization, again, it's almost like reinforced concrete. You're pulling that up through that's going to make the whole organization stable at multiple levels, and you got to have that. But it begins with that foundation, and then continues with making sure you maintain that with new people coming in, with your people as they move up through the organization. But it certainly has to be very deliberate. And again, how you go about doing that, again, it's back to it depends. What does your organization need with the type of people, with the type of processes, with the type of industry you're in, even the type of company you are. Are you global? Are you not? So you need to understand all that about your organization so you can put the right things in place that are going to help maintain that.
Yeah, very good. Jim, there is a quote people have quoted you by. This quote that you can do lean, you can do TWI without lean, but you cannot do lean without TWI.
Yeah, you won't become lean by using TWI, but you won't become lean without using TWI.
Yeah. So what were your thoughts behind this when you made this sentence a long time ago?
I guess my thought behind it was this: is obviously TWI in and of itself is a great training-based skill set program, particularly for the 5 skills of the supervisor. There's 3 skills, so it in and of itself is a great training program. But for the lean enterprise, that won't make you a lean enterprise. because there's so many other dynamics around that, particularly from a flow standpoint, of material, a flow standpoint of information. So what the lean enterprise is about from a larger scale is much more than that. So that's what I mean by that. And obviously during the war, and even in Japan, even though companies have used TWI for many years, there's lots of companies that aren't lean companies as we think about them, even though they may do the TWI methodology very well, and their people are very astute at that. But the other side of it is it's so foundational and so critical to the lean enterprise from that skill set, from that behavioral pattern, and in a way that's what you're trying to do with it. You're creating this behavioral pattern in the short and long term. With the longer term is you want to create a thinking pattern. So that's why you won't be able to become lean without TWI, because it is that basic skill set of behavior and of thinking, which ultimately leads to problem solving. So if you look at the lean enterprise, I always will say this: it's about flow, ideally one-piece flow, and a lot of the tools you get into are about flow. If you look at pull systems, if you look at setup reduction, all these different tools, they're about manifesting flow, ideally. There are ways to do that. So how are you going to do that? Well, the only way to implement flow is by solving problems in order to do that. If you look at Kanban, what is it? It's an inventory management, resolving the inventory management problem. Ideally, we'd like to be at one-piece flow. Well, if we're going from one plant supplying to another plant 500 miles away, you physically aren't going to be able to do one-piece flow. So it's a way to move you closer to that. Well, let's do small batches and do it very orderly and do it consistently. If you look at setup reduction, you have some processes that you have to live with, like in press work. That by the nature of the process is a batch process, but setup reduction helps you get closer and closer to one-piece flow. Well, what are you trying to do by that? You're solving problems. You're putting in countermeasures to move that direction. So with TWI, you need that baseline understanding on how to solve problems. Whether it's JI, JM, or JR, all those are surrounded by solving problems. So when you get that basic knowledge, basic skill set, basic behavior, basic thinking in place, then you can solve problems. So if you're trying to implement flow, you can only do that by solving problems. The only way you can solve problems is through people. So therefore, the only way you can do that is develop your people. And TWI is this foundational skill set to allow people to be able to develop and to think through problems and to identify problems and help to resolve them. So if you look at the lean enterprise and just any business, it's usually made up of different functions. You have functions like operations, functions accounting, human resources, product development. A lot of times we refer to those as silos. You have these different silos, and all those important skills, important functions an organization needs to be effective at, particularly a lean organization. But if there's a few things, TWI being this, again, one of those foundational things, so those, I guess I call those verticals. You need to be very, from a lean standpoint, you need to be very astute at these verticals. But there's also there's horizontal aspects of it, because even though you may be good at those things need to integrate from a lean enterprise standpoint. And TWI is certainly a foundational skill set, again, that helps you have this basic, again, behavioral pattern, thinking pattern that allows you to help integrate horizontally across these different disciplines you have in your organization. So if you want to become a lean enterprise, you certainly need to do all those effectively, those different silos, those different business functions. But until you really learn how to do that from the horizontal and integrate them, only then will you become really truly a lean enterprise, like I think most of us are striving to become, figuring out how to learn how to do that. Probably the other interesting thing with that today is there's still very, very few companies that have achieved that. So there isn't really this defined pattern to go through. So it's still back to the learn by doing. You got to figure out what does that mean in the context of your own organization. What does that mean in your own industry? So again, I think that's a frontier left to be yet discovered and learned and deployed through case studies and lessons and things like that from other organizations. So there's still lots of work to do in that area. Something companies do that are lean or moving in that direction or implementing it, and some companies even if they're fairly far along, what they do is they'll do implementation through a series of projects or workshops, Kaizen workshop, Kaizen blitz, and so forth. Ideally, where organizations would like to get to or should get to is where they're making these improvements, daily incremental improvements, or improvements incrementally every day. And the only way to really get there, particularly from a structured standpoint, from an effective standpoint, is through TWI. And that's, again, giving people the skills with the behavior and thinking. And of course, you need some level of structure that puts in place so they can accomplish this continuous improvement day in, day out, every shift, every hour. So that's a critical feature and ability that TWI will get you there, is to have the ability so your people, your organization can make these incremental daily improvements every single day. And it's essentially, that's what Kaizen is really about. Because Kaizen's, the translation of it is small improvements every day, where a lot of organizations, again, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but you need to use it in the right context. The Kaizen Blitz, it's really, actually the Japanese term for it, I think, is Kaikaku. Really, they shouldn't be called Kaizen workshops, they should be called Kaikaku workshops. Is that the right translation? So to really do true Kaizen is to do, through TWI, doing these incremental improvements, problem solving day in, day out. So certainly infrastructure, structure is important, getting the right people into supervisory positions, and even from a Toyota perspective, anybody in any position. So actually one of their biggest criteria is particular characteristics. What are the characteristics of these people, the persons that they're hiring or putting into these positions? So they really go through that process. And maybe I'll relate this to an engineer, if that's my background, is okay, you have an engineering degree, okay, that's great, check that one off, but then they really get into the details of what's this person's personality traits, what are their characteristics. So that'd be the same thing for a supervisor. So if they get the right person, the right characteristics, then they can train them with the skills and the techniques that they need to be successful. And then the evaluation or auditing process really probably is a feedback loop on how do we help this person continually improve in his ability, in his skill set, and all that. So where are his strengths and where are his weaknesses? Scott was touching on this. Where are his strengths and where are his weaknesses, and how do we shore up those weaknesses? Not these are weaknesses as a negative thing, but these are weaknesses as a positive thing, because it now gives us our objectives we need to achieve to help this person raise them up to a higher level. So that's really the infrastructure you need in place in order to achieve that. I like the events as a learning tool, not as a implementation tool. You can certainly get some implementation out of it, but it's really, I always saw those as, it's a good classroom environment to see people, how you can think differently and think very rapidly and make changes quickly. Okay, now once you've got that mindset changed around with that, now you come back in, this is where TWI would come back. Now let's give them the real skills so they actually can utilize that thinking that you've been able to turn your thinking around, that we can accomplish this stuff, and actually pretty rapidly, not in a rapid fire standpoint, but if you put the skill sets in place with like what TWI teaches, then they know with these skills, now I know what I can really achieve. I know we can make these changes.